Good morning. Wow, what an amazing day yesterday. Yeah, really. Nuala, thanks. And to the panelists yesterday, just pushing edges. And, when I enter into a conference, I'm always delighted about the new discoveries. And yesterday was just replete with new discoveries. So thank you to everyone, and also to the people who asked questions last night and yesterday afternoon. So I'll just take you through a couple of things today, how the day will unfold. In a minute, we're back in Nuala's hands. She'll present today again, and then we'll follow this with a question period. You'll stretch, though, just after Nuala's conversation. I ask you just to kind of get up, and then some time with Nuala just asking questions, making comments, as we did last night. And then I'm going to invite the whole conference to break out into three spaces, just to go down at the lower campus. There are lower part of this building. There are 3 rooms: classroom 1, classroom 2, and a seminar room. And just divide yourselves up. You don't have, if you want to go with your friends or whatever, and just to have a conversation. Some of the students who are taking this as a credit course will be there too, just to facilitate a conversation about the things we're bumping into, so that collectively we all find a voice here at this symposium. Your ideas and the germination of ideas is a critical dimension within any kind of conversation. This is a moving feast, a moving target, and your ideas and thoughts are instrumental in how we move forward. So that's how, and then we'll have a lunch break, and lunch is provided. There are 2 spaces for lunches. They have exactly the same food. One's going to be down in classroom 1, and the other's in the President's Lodge. And we have about an hour for lunch, so that if people want to walk around the campus, feel free to do that. So that's how the morning goes. The afternoon is very similar. Susan Chisholm, who did an extraordinary project on the physician's experience of or feelings around end of life, is going to be here talking about end of life and physician and medically assisted dying in a very overt way from inside the crucible of doctors and their experiences and their fears and anxieties. So that's how the afternoon goes. So it should be a pretty pressure-packed day, okay? If it isn't, then we failed. So one other quick thing about this conference, it really began about 3 years ago, and as we heard last night in a tribute to Archbishop Hayes, about 3 years ago we decided that we wanted to do something in honor of Archbishop Hayes and his extraordinary pastoral capacity. One of the great anecdotes, for those who've ever spent time in palliative care, particularly where people are receiving chemotherapy, you would have often seen, I often saw Archbishop Hayes up there, and one day he was very faithful to a woman who was kind of embarrassed because, as she was about to point out to him, she said to him, to Archbishop Hayes, who had just sat gently with her for quite a while during her, and regularly during her treatment, she kind of said to him, well, you know, Archbishop Hayes, I'm not Roman Catholic. And he said, I know. Our companionship is companionship, and that's the example that he gave and the legacy he gave. And so for 3 years we began to plan, and then it became obvious that there was only one person that we could invite to be our keynote and driving force behind that, and that's someone who's been a dear friend of his for 50 years, and that's Nuala Kenny. So we really designed this around 2 amazing forces, Archbishop Hayes and Nuala Kenny. And before I turn everything over to her again, I want to light the candle that will guide us through the time. So this is a spiritual thing. People are praying in a prayer throughout this conference because of what we're looking at, and for you too. So we'll take a second to light the candle, turn our thoughts toward the divine, who is always with us, who was here long before we arrived this morning and will be here long after we leave. I would have prayed over there, but there was this back feedback, and I was afraid the voice of God was going to come out at me. So, no, seriously, I was afraid the voice of God was. So, let's just take a second. God of light, in a world where there is darkness, may we radiate your light. In a world where there is pain, May we find ourselves as ointment. In a world where cries go unheard and tears unreceived, may we be presence. And this light that guides this conference these 3 days, may it enkindle in us a spirit of hope, of joy, of life, of courage, and of love. These virtues, these qualities, so much needed in our world this day. Bless each of us and hold us. We ask this through our Creator. Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, Nuala Kenny.
Am I on? Yes. Some people think I'm always on. I'm many things, but never dull. And people constantly say to me, where do you get I'm going to be 72 next week. People say to me, where do you get the energy? And I do not know, but I can tell you, if you had seen me at 11:02 last night, like a puddle on the floor. But the Lord gives you grace to do what you need to do. So, for those of you who were with us last evening, or yesterday afternoon, and then last evening, so we've got folks who come from different perspectives. So there'll be a few things that I'll try to continue so that we can overlap, but we have a different focus this morning. So many of you will know, if you were there last night, yesterday the day was really focused on dying. And even the choice of Wit, the film that was the object of the afternoon, and the reflection on that was about kind of the difficulty of dying in the technological-oriented hospital world in which we find ourselves. So that was, last night was the actual dying process. Today, more explicitly in the planning, Jody had said, well, can we focus on death on the second day, and particularly the issue of suffering and death, this great mystery of humankind. So that's the theme. And as I start, before I begin with the very first slide, so I'm a Roman Catholic sister who's a professor of medicine, and I've never worked in a Catholic institution in my life. I'm a professor of medicine. We have no Catholic medical schools in Canada. I'm a Canadian by adoption, but I am Canadian, American by birth, dual citizen. But I'm also a professor of pediatrics and then bioethics. We have no children's hospitals that are Catholic. So I have always been a very public Roman Catholic Christian in the public space of medicine, just so you understand my background. But when I started to do ethics more formally, I did use the expression, which is profoundly important to me, comes out of the long-standing Christian tradition of a good death. All right, now just before we start, now I'm going to tease out the really good Roman Catholics from the rest of you. Catholics, who was the patron saint of a good death? Oh my God, Bishop, there's nobody in the room that fulfills the obligation. Nobody knows? Oh, come on. Go. Good girl, good girl. Good girl. A couple of you knew. The deacon was just... So, what you need to understand is that this long-standing tradition of a good death has no scriptural foundation. But this is the image that I want you to think, because then I want you to hear the comment, because I use the expression, because there is now empirical literature about what moderns think is a good death. And the qualities are actually the same as in our moral imagination. So, in Christian tradition, particularly Roman Catholic, because we have saints for everything, right? St. Joseph is the patron of a good death. Now, I didn't bring this slide because I got too much other stuff, but I love this story. In your mind, imagine the death of this just man, Joseph. This good Jewish man, called by God, just as Mary, the good Jewish girl, to do something extraordinary. And he is, what we know of him in Scripture, he's the just man. He's at the end of his days. And in the Christian imagination, this just man dying with Jesus, to whom he was earthly father, and Mary, his wife, and the mother of the Son, on either side of him. He's a just man, and in our moral imagination, with his loved ones around him, ready to go to God. Going to God knowing he lived his life as best he could, trying to do what he thought God asked of him. So that's this peaceful, surrounded by those whom you love, willing to move to the next, trusting in the God whom you trusted in your whole life. Anyway, that's very important understanding for me. But I use the expression good death in one of my general lectures to medical students, third years in ethics. This hand shot up, and this keener young medical student stood up and said, "Dr. Kenny, how can any death be good?" Oh, just hold. Remember, we were talking yesterday about paradoxes. We're going to do it again. For many, there is no sense that death, not just because it's medical failure, which was the mindset he was bringing to it, could be good. Well, that's just bunk. So as we look at today, because the symposium is in honor of Archbishop Hayes, I had a different quote last night from him and things I'd learned. I'm going to give you a different one to start us today. Bishop Hayes was representing the Canadian Conference of Bishops in 1992 at some big conference, I think it was in Ottawa, on Christian funerals. Remember, liturgy and care of the sick were his, and ecumenism, but liturgy was big for him. Listen, he's talking about the ritual of Christian funerals, the burial rites, and the importance of those in faith communities. The ritual, both in its prayers and its pastoral notes, tells us not only how we can provide spiritual care to the sick, but in remarkable ways, it also shows us how the sick can minister to us who are well. In a truly caring situation, both the patient and the caregivers help one another to understand the meaning and to share the burden. Last night we talked a little bit about vulnerability and about the notion that compassion requires us truly to be able to enter into the suffering of another if we are to alleviate that suffering. So the theme now this morning, I think I'm going to take from this, because we're thinking of suffering and a good death, and you can see I'm going to be particularly focusing on this question of how in a truly caring situation, both those who are patients or the persons who are very sick and dying, and those who care for them, mutually, if they enter into what's happening, mutually assist each other in understanding meaning, and more importantly, in sharing the burden. So I'm going to say, as we know, that in sharing the burden, we are in fact going to be witnessing a very important concept, certainly a very important concept in faith traditions. That there are things to which we witness not just by our words, but by our actions and by our lives. So I'm going to suggest that part of the challenge that we're going to be exploring today is recognizing that suffering is at the heart of what we're going to review again in a moment, is the modern attempt to alleviate suffering by ending life. That this puzzle of suffering is this deep, long-standing human experience for persons of all faiths and no faiths. I mean, periodically, when I think of suffering, I go to the images in Job, right? In the book of Job, and it's like not again, God, what did you give me now? And he thinks he's going to get, then it gets worse and worse and worse. So we have a long-standing, in every Christian tradition, an exploration of the issue of suffering. But I want us now, as we approach, because remember, shared burden is going to be a theme. Entering into, together, this mystery of suffering so that we might alleviate it will be the theme. So I want it to be very, very clear, particularly because I come from the world of medicine as well as the world of religion, and as a religious. I don't mean mystery like Murder, She Wrote. This is not a Sherlock Holmes novel. Mystery here is not, I love mysteries. I love Victorian mystery. This is not a mystery to be figured out. Aha, I have the answer to suffering. This is the use of the word mystery in the way that we use it in religious, spiritual understanding. This is mystery as transcendent. This is mystery as something which is in fact unknowable in its fullness. So I'm asking you to think of that when we begin to now explore the issue, folks who think they know suffering and have a way of responding to it completely are just simply lacking in an understanding of the depth and complexity. This is a notion, when we talk about the mystery of suffering, there are things knowable, and I'm going to give you a bunch of those, that have huge implications for us in sharing the burden this morning. But I want us to understand that the mystery concept I'm using isn't the puzzle to be figured out, aha, eureka. It is rather to be in awe of the depth and complexity, to stand in humility before a mystery that is in fact unknowable. The nature of the issue is unknowable. The other thing that I want us to kind of look at is the root. So patient, isn't it interesting? Patients really have to be patient. But the root, it's similar to, in the Latin, to the roots for words that are passive. But patior, I suffer, okay, is generally understood to be something that is completely and entirely passive. I suffer. As we explore this today, I want you to begin to think of what many, many spiritual writers in many religious traditions have really made very, very clear. When you suffer, it is not simply a passive event. That suffering can be, if entered into in this deep way, something very active. Now, again, in the Christian tradition, suffering actually becomes redemptive, the ultimate act. But so we have a tendency to think of suffering as a puzzle to be solved and think of something passive. Oh my God, you're suffering. And you're not an agent involved in dealing with the suffering. And then the final kind of general concept in this sharing burden that you're going to hear repeated is what we began to discuss last night, which is that compassion is to suffer with. Compassion is not empathy. Compassion is not sympathy. In terms of the virtue of compassion, it actually has two movements. One, it tries to get inside as much as possible the experience of another, not simply to be an objective observer, even though no one can know, I know exactly what you're going through. Baloney. But to try to get inside what the experience is becomes an important first movement in compassion. But compassion, that's empathy or sympathy. Compassion then compels you to do something about it. So the other theme that we're going to be kind of exploring in the sharing the burden is, in order to be compassionate to those who are suffering, you're going to have to be vulnerable. And in fact, remember, for those of you there last night, the very last question about treating patients who are dying with symptoms that are distressing, not because of the patient's needs, but because of the family or loved one or caregiver's needs, winds up being very, very frequently a problem because it's difficult to participate actively in the dying of another. So, shared burden, witnessing suffering. So last night, we reflected on what I call the first of the two paradoxes of our time. And those paradoxes are avoid death at all costs. You can't, the death-defying world in which we find ourselves. If you find the right doctor with the right hospital with the right equipment, you too will be immortal, whatever that might mean. You know, there's a whole science of biogerontology, biosenescence. It's the science using earthworms and all these other, to find ways to see if we could extend the biologic lifespan indefinitely. Well, isn't that an interesting idea? But in our time, we do have this, on the one hand, obsessive pursuit of technology, including, in the face of inevitable dying, still having people focus on the goal of medicine for cure of substantial improvement rather than on the goal of palliation and assistance with the spiritual goals at end of life. Those are the three traditional goals of medicine. In fact, traditionally in medicine, the goal of cure, until the 20th century, people thought that was rare, almost miraculous, because almost all medicine is what the first goal of medicine is, which is the improvement of symptoms, which is the improvement of function. Okay? So what we saw last night was the dying in our world, with this focus on machines can fix it, technical answer. There is a machine, there is a drug. Now we're moving to part two, which is the paradox in the light of, in fact, avoid death at all costs. Here we now have social, legal influences that choose death, and not only choose death, but choose death as a treatment, and not only choose death as a treatment, but choose death as a treatment for human suffering. So we're going to explore today how some of those things might come together. So one comment I just want to make as we move into this then, I'll just remind you of the Supreme Court decision and Bill C-14, which is now being debated. Now, it's still being debated. We still don't know fundamental things about this bill, and it comes into effect on June 7th, so less than 3 weeks away, and we still don't know the details. But I just want you to think of this concept. To think of death as a treatment, and when we think of assisted death as one of the options in care, the general philosophic understanding is that in order to have it to be a treatment, there has to be some action applied that then gives benefit after the action is received to the person who receives it. I'm giving you a treatment, and then I look and, oh my gosh, after the treatment, look, you're doing real well. Death as a treatment becomes oxymoronic. There's no patient to assess the benefit of the treatment after the treatment. But we've come to understand in our technological orientation that it's a treatment. And then the topic that we're going to talk about, because it has the implications, so how ought we respond to suffering? Not only is death suggested in the second part of the paradox as a treatment, but it's for suffering. So we're going to explore that again briefly. Because the question for today is, in assessing this part of the paradox of death and dying in our world, so how ought we, you, me, us, not just as individuals, but as communities? And we're going to explore that because part of the problem of our time is that our local social communities are not what they were. It's not like everybody in Bridgewater is either Catholic or Methodist. I'm making up the distinction. And there are no Jews in Bridgewater, by the way. They live in Halifax. We used to have sociocultural areas that responded to and reinforced our basic beliefs. Now, second commonest language in downtown Spring Garden Road? Arabic. It's not even French in Nova Scotia, right? So that our faith communities, in a sense, other than if you belong to a community of stamp collectors or fly fishermen, and I'm not being facetious, that's for some people those are their communities. The place that they find some kind of belonging has nothing to do with faith issues. But what I'm saying to you is that for all of us, our faith communities now are all in the minority. Each separately and all together, the issue of those who belong to communities for whom the issues of mystery and transcendence are central, for whom the issue of we do this together. We try to understand God's action in our lives and respond together. Those issues of community are going to become more important than ever before in response, and yet look at our social communities and then look at our faith communities, dwindling and challenged as they are. So a reminder now. So the issue of response to suffering, shared burden, which we're focusing on this morning, turns at this time in human history on a challenge absolutely unprecedented for Canada, and up until 25 years ago, unprecedented in the modern world. That is the legalization, the authorization of physician-assisted death. Now, there are days when I truly don't think people understand, for 2,400 years of the Hippocratic ethic, doctors did not kill. Now, it was debated, we had debates in medical history, because the power of medicine was understood to be so great that docs have always had the ability to kill. 2,000 years before the Christian era, a physician in downtown Cyprus could end the life of a patient if he wanted. Right? There's no medical advance here. We're going to see that the issues bringing this total transformation. I'm appalled that my colleagues in medicine don't understand. This is the reversal of a 2,400-year tradition in medicine. I'm not even talking about faith. And it's like, well, doctors now have a duty to do whatever the patient wants them to do. What the is that? Doctor's obligation is to bring to patients medically, I'm an allopathic physician. I'm not a naturopath. They do something else towards human well-being. My whole task is to bring you an evidence-based set of this possible intervention could give you this benefit with this risk, but I bring you something. You don't come to me and say to me, I want you to end my life. So you need to understand that there's a paradigm shifting that to me is not understood either by my colleagues in medicine or socially. But within this, and now this becomes important, as of June 6th, 2015, assisted death, physician-assisted death in this country has been legal. There was a stay put on its being brought into effect in order to provide regulation and legislation to make this work. So who provides it, what are the criteria, et cetera. We'll just look at those challenges in a moment. So the important thing here is this is the decision, and the key elements so that we can talk about suffering and recognize its centrality to this decision is it decriminalized physician-assisted death, talked last night, for competent adults with a grievous medical condition, has nothing to do with terminal illness, has nothing to do with dying directly. Okay? It has to do with a grievous medical condition, including an illness, disease, or disability, that is irremediable. There is no cure. And I reminded you last night, for most things in medicine, there's no cure. Infectious disease, yeah, you got a fracture, hey, we can pretty well. But most things, deep-rooted, major, no cure. And that, most importantly, causes enduring suffering. So the law itself is talking about suffering. Now, because we're going to think of shared burden, you need to see where we are today. There's a long journey, and I've been involved in lots of different steps along the way. Bill C-14, so just understand this. The centrality of the Supreme Court decision is grievous medical condition, irremediable, causes intolerable suffering as judged by the person. And it's turning on suffering. All kinds of actions, provincially, federally, and in terms of regulatory bodies for physicians and nurses in particular, have tried to work on criteria. Because the June 6th decision of the Supreme Court as such, it is the most liberal assisted death proposed legislation, judicial decision in the world. You need to understand this. Even in the Benelux countries in Europe, much less the Oregon is much more constrained. But what the Supreme Court decided was eons apart from, as such, in its breadth, in its liberality, little l. So where we are now with Bill 17, all kinds of people recommending, and you need to understand, for this issue of shared burden, there have been two issues that have been crucially important. One, protection of the vulnerable. Remember, this is turning on a competent adult deciding their suffering is unendurable. Well, let's plumb that. And second, the issue of protection of conscience. If this is paradigm shifting, not just for medicine, but also for persons of faith perspectives, see, we can no longer in the public sphere talk about the sanctity of life. People look at that, Nuala, for God, come on. You know, that's a little Catholic Christian concept. The sanctity of life. Come on. We can talk dignity, and we will. But there are concepts that are no longer able to be discussed in the public life. The notion that we are not, that God is in fact in charge of our lives, that there's a higher power. Nuala, that's a little idiosyncratic, you know. I do fly fishing, you're a Christian. Same kind of interesting personal choice with no relevance in the public space. So two big issues of concern. One is protection of the vulnerable, and you're going to see how that's going to be the place where I'm ending with shared burden. What kind of vulnerability brings people to a sense that their suffering is so intolerable that in fact death, ending their life, is the only way to end their suffering? And then what are the obligations of caring communities? But with Bill C-14, looking at some of these, this is what, just some key things. Still, we're clueless as to what's going to happen. These are all amendments now being debated in Parliament. And by the way, let me tell you this. I'm not a betting woman, but if I were asked to bet, are we going to pass Bill C-14, I wouldn't put any money down. It may fail, not because of the reasons I would wish, because then what happens is the Supreme Court decision, unregulated becomes the law of the land. It may fail because it's not liberal enough. The Senate has said it's not going to support it. The unelected Senate may in fact overturn any limitation. But what Bill C-14 did try to do, remember, paying attention to vulnerability? So all of us, regardless of what our religious background would be, surely would be committed to protection of the vulnerable, right? Surely, we all share this passion. So what Bill C-14 has in play, first of all, it defined adult as 18. There's all this misunderstanding about children, but you need to understand that we don't have one age of adult legally across this country. Every province is different. So, but you need to understand, at least Bill C-14 said, no, this is 18 and older. Okay, come to the second one, because we're going to plumb this in a minute. A voluntary request and consent. I want you to, we'll look in a minute about vulnerability and how vulnerability affects the voluntary informed consent. Because we all have this understanding in modern world, informed choice. It's like when I teach medical students, some of them think, you go in and you say to the patient, well, this is the procedure, so there's like a 50% chance that you'll die on the operating table. And those you watched with, the way that they explored these things, it was almost that technical. But even when there's a little more humane communication, it's not as if, okay, so now I've given you all that information, dear, and I'll be back tomorrow morning and I'd like a decision on whether or not we do the amputation. As if informed choice for something about your life and health was pop in some information into the computer and say, okay, go process it, da-da-da, doodle-doo, da-da-da, this is what I'm going to do. My God, this is your life. So the issue that we're seeing is concerns like issues of voluntary request, which is central to this notion of this is an autonomous individual act, a right, really needs to be plumbed from the perspective of protection of the vulnerable. The issue of whether or not mental illness, psychiatric diagnosis as the only diagnosis, justifies the issue of assisted death is up for grabs. Now this, please understand, persons with a psychiatric illness can be competent to make a medical decision. Persons who are depressed are not competent to make a medical decision. Persons who are in full flight of a schizophrenic episode are not competent to make a medical decision. But you need to understand not just whether or not there's competency in the midst of a medical diagnosis, but is a psychiatric diagnosis, but is a psychiatric diagnosis in and of itself? Does that warrant intolerable suffering? Well, according to the criteria, the answer would be yes. But when we plumb vulnerability, you'll see, wait a minute. There are issues about psychiatric illness and stigma that affect how independent and competent you are when you come to make a decision about choice. And that relates to us in care. Big issue. Whether or not there will be advanced directives, particularly for dementia. That, my friends, you heard it here from Nuala if you haven't heard it before. In 3 years' time, the Hay Symposium should be on dementia care. And we will then be horrified what has happened. Horrified at what has happened here. Because this is the issue at stake. The criteria require that you're experiencing an intolerable suffering. But in an advance directive, and you're competent to make the decision, in an advance directive, you're giving a direction for when this happens to me. So you're not experiencing it yet, but you're saying, when it happens to me, this is what I want to happen. It becomes so complex. And when we understand, talk about shared burden, the incredible burden of caring for persons with dementias, the huge burden rising with our aging population, you can see that some of the vulnerability here is going to be profound. Not just for care of the elderly, which we're going to be one of the things ending with, but particularly for care of those who have dementia, because it is on the rise. It is the thing most people fear. Most people, when they age, you talk about end of life, when they age, what are the two things they don't want? I don't want to go to a nursing home, and I don't want to have dementia. Then, so Bill C-14 did still repeat that it's a serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability, so still not confined to end of life, except look at the advanced state of irreversible decline, and then the very last reasonably foreseeable natural death. This is an addition that Bill C-14 put in place so that it began to limit the early choices. A 26-year-old just been through first episode of schizophrenia, now on drugs, stabilized, doesn't like the drugs, remembers what it was like to have the episode and says, this is intolerable, it's incurable, it's serious, end it. So it's moving it at least more towards an end of life, but whether or not that will remain, we don't know. And then endurable and intolerable suffering, which is where we're going to go next. So we talked last night, I'm going to repeat this for those of you who weren't there last night, but this has been a long journey since 1993 to a shift in the way in which we look at the issue of suffering and the issue of not just patients having the right to request, but also physicians having an obligation, and nurse practitioners are under this legislation, having an obligation to respond. Long journey. What I want you to pay attention to as we now move into a reflection about vulnerability and suffering in more detail is the obfuscation of language along the way. Everybody knows this, right? Language shapes our behavior and our mores shape our language. They're mutually interactive. At least when people began to talk about this in the 70s and 80s, they called it mercy killing. They named it for what it is. It's killing. I mean, I have people who think, oh my God, Nuala, don't use it. This is not killing. What the heck do you think it is? It's the intentional ending of a life. Now, please understand, morally, most every moral tradition would say killing itself is wrong. But there are reasons for killing. A soldier will do that to protect a village of innocents. A police officer will do that to stop harm from being done to individuals in the course of a crime. The act is still wrong, but the moral responsibility for that act is mitigated because of the intention and motivation of the person. So it is killing. But what was supposed to, in fact, justify it was the notion that in actual fact it was for mercy. Hold that, we're going to come back to mercy. The Catholics in the room, and I hope the rest of you do know, that our Pope Francis, my new BFF, has declared, sorry Bishop Mancini, but he really is my new BFF, this is a year of mercy. I mean, if you've read the stuff that he's writing on mercy, it's like phenomenal, phenomenal. But mercy killing. Then what we went to, okay, don't use that language. Then we're moving into the late 60s, 70s. Now it's the right to die. This is hilarious. So I'm sorry to tell you, what's your first name? Sherry. Sherry. I'm sorry to tell you, Sherry, but I'm not giving you the right to die. Did you hear what I just said? How can I not give her the right not to die? How can you give a right to something? It's ridiculous. The language misrepresents what's at stake. What's at stake is the right to choose the circumstances and the timing of my death. But it comes out as the right to die. The silliest thing in the world, because you can't not have the right. You're going to die. Sorry to tell you this, Sherry. If you need me later, I will see you in counseling. But now I want to end here as we move to the vulnerable and our mutual responsibility. This is now driving me crazy. The language of the bills, and including Bill C-14, is medical aid in dying. No, 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 no. It's medical aid in death. Medical aid in dying is what good medicine, good family care, and the specialty of palliative care have always been about. They are about the process of dying, not the moment of death. This is the proper language, and you hear me use it all, but it's medical aid in death. Now I want you to look at the acronym that is being used across this country as institutions and regional health authorities develop their rules and regulation. These are rules and regulations for the MAID service. Medical aid in dying service. This is obscene. That they would be comfortable with an acronym that so trivializes what's happening here. But this is the language. It's in provincial legislatures right across this country. Yeah. So, the context in which we find ourselves, we talked about death-denying, death-defying culture, decline of religion, individualism, technological dominance. The focus I want to now turn to for today's reflection, because we're going to talk about the burden of care and the mutual support, is a concept I did not explicate last evening under the medicalization of life, but it is the professionalization of care. We in the 21st century now expect every care need for all of our friends and loved ones to be taken care of by public services. Now, please understand, I have worked in ethics and health policy my whole life. I actually decided to practice in Canada because our healthcare system is universally publicly funded. Its value system is we do this together in solidarity, though we've never really fulfilled Tommy Douglas's dream of Canadian Medicare, Part 2. But I want you to now hang on to this notion that we now, there was a headline probably 2.5 years ago now, a problem with an elderly woman's care at the Victoria General site in the city. And there was a wait for her to get to a long-term care placement, but this huge problem, not enough placements after older, vulnerable people get into hospital and then they can't go back to their independent supported living. They need a place and we don't have enough places. And the daughter, she was in this step-down wait unit, her daughter, fuming in the headlines. Can you imagine that when I went into the VG to see my mother yesterday, I was expected to help with her bathing. I want you to think about what I just said. This is her mother. The hospital was helping to assess her mother because her mother's needs needed assessment. Who has the primary responsibility to bathe and comfort and support her mother, your mother, my mother, our friends? It's us. But we have all opted into there's professionals out there. So you're going to see where I'm going to go with this. This contextual reality is going to bring this burden of care right back to us as communities. But begin to think about that. With the medicalization of life has come the professionalization of all aspects of care. Remember, I shared last night the two events in 1967, the year I entered medical school. One was the first successful heart transplant, and as I said, from then on in, dead is not dead. Okay? We think now medicine performs resurrection regularly and as expected, but that received headlines and dominated my medical career, technology, and medical advance. But the development of St. Christopher's Hospice by the devout Anglican Cecily Saunders. By the way, some of you don't know this. Cecily was by training a nurse. Then she went and did social work involved with care of the dying. And then she decided, I better go read medicine. So she was a one-person healthcare team. This absolutely remarkable woman who was beautifully, beautifully motivated by her Christian faith. So she forms St. Christopher's Hospice. And I want to begin now to talk about how hospice and palliative care began to be a way within medicine and healthcare to deal with caring for the dying and seriously ill, attending to the issues of suffering, not just their physical symptoms. So you'll see, and the little footprints are because yesterday I talked about the steps towards the dominance of the technical and technical fix, and then prophetic resistance against. Well, palliative care is prophetic resistance. So palliative care is medical aid in dying. Notice it's bolded. And I gave you the goals of palliative care. Neither hastens nor prolongs death. And there you are. It's you. Okay? In fact, the provision of palliative care does, for many people, extend the expected life. It's because their care needs are being met appropriately. What this philosophically means is we do not intentionally prolong biologic life when dying is what's happened. We help people live until their last days. So there's kind of a misunderstanding of but it's a foundational goal. Here, balances pain and symptom control with fullest participation in last things, focuses on the dying person and their intimate others. That's what palliative care really, really was supposed to be doing. So hold that as we come to the shared burden. And then, please understand, the initial philosophy, and the people who want conscientious objection are not only a number of individuals, mainly the doctors I know from religious traditions, both Christian and Jewish, and Muslim, want conscientious objection, but also palliative care doctors. So a few palliative care doctors are advocates for this, but the vast majority of palliative care doctors want nothing to do with this because it's contradictory. So, this is important. Palliative care was a resistance that had an understanding of the total person care needed. It was a commitment to do good. Palliative care is not when you can't do anything else, refer them to palliative care. It's when it's clear that the goals should be the goals of palliation, then you do first-rate medical care, but the medical care is balanced by attention to the spiritual needs and the family, the support of the loved ones. And I don't use family, I usually use the word intimate others, because for many people, it's not their family at end of life. It's their intimate others. It's who's ever been their loving supports. So the history of palliative care, and this is important. Hospice palliative care is not a site of care. It's a philosophy of care that has those goals I just showed you. And this is important because when we talk about shared burden and community, most assisted deaths are going to occur where? In the home. And they're going to be occurring in rural communities, small and large, in the home. So you can, when we talk about vulnerability in a minute, hold that notion. Hold that notion. So those of you who think palliative care, thinking of the unit, the great unit, for example, at the VG, no. Palliative care is a philosophy, not a site of care. The first wave, we explored last night, was a resistance. What Dame Cecily was doing was saying, my God, people are now terrified. All this technological advance is wonderful, but people are terrified they're going to die with a tube in every orifice. Every human body hole is going to have something going in or coming out of it. And the dominance of that technological is going to be depersonalizing. That was her prophetic resistance. But what happened is, as palliative care began to develop, and I remember saying, palliative care is either the best thing that's happened to medicine in returning it to the human, or the worst. It's the best thing that ever happened if it brings all of us to a new understanding of the balance between care of the body, care of the soul, care of the individual, care of their loved ones. It's the worst thing that ever happened if palliative care becomes the specialty that takes care of dying. And you know what? A little bit of both has happened. So what has happened in the second wave of palliative care's development, and please understand, I love palliative care folk. I just love them. They're just amazing. But what's happened is palliative care has focused so much now on pain and symptom control that its ability to, in fact, deal with these larger spiritual issues and communal issues has really been blunted some. It's been blunted. David Roy, the founder of the Journal of Palliative Care, Montreal ethicist, he talks about the domestication of palliative care, that what's happened is it's now focused on who's a palliative care physician, who can practice palliative care, can family docs do it, regulation, institutionalization. Hold this thought. The minute you institutionalize something, you take away from the movement. Palliative care from Cecily was a movement. It was a movement inside to transform and shape the values. And then, look at the second wave is also met as palliative care. Who talked about, was it the P word or no? Anyway, well, I talk about the P word. People say, oh my God, no, Dr. Kenny, you can't talk to my father about palliative care. He'll give up hope. Now, we could spend the rest of the day unpacking that sentence if you'd like. But the P word became not a wonderful thing that could happen for those who are clearly dying, that third goal of medicine, but something to be avoided. So one of the things that we're going to see is that the shared burden as we go forward is going to require the community to do some things differently, but also palliative care to be renewed, revitalized to its full potential. Now what I want us to focus on is suffering as the cause of a request for assisted death and what we can do to alleviate suffering. I'm just going to give you, I've written a book chapter on this, and I've got, 50 references from the Supreme Court. The first major review in 2000, and you'll see, this is Linda Emanuel. She's not a good Catholic girl, but she's a fabulous physician. Linda did the first review of the reasons that we had in jurisdictions where assisted death was legal and not legal. So this isn't a conclusion, so I'm giving you the journals only so you know this is legit medical stuff. JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association. Her conclusion, 2000. The key determinants of interest in euthanasia, she was using that for both euthanasia and assisted suicide. The key determinants of interest in euthanasia relate not to physical symptoms, but to psychological distress and care needs. Oregon, Linda Ganzini, the major research reviewer for the Supreme Court decision in 2008, reviewed Oregon's experience. The most important reasons for physician-assisted death were wanting to control the circumstances of death and die at home, wanting to control the circumstances of death, and worries about the loss of dignity and future losses. Sorry, I see some people trying to take, anybody who wants my slides, it's on this computer, and there's got to be a way that AST can let you have, you can have anything I've got. The most important reasons, worries about loss of dignity, hold that, we're going to pursue that in a minute, and future losses of independence, about quality of life in future, and self-care ability. Look at the next sentence. No physical symptom at the time of the request for assisted death were rated higher than a median of 2 on a scale of 1 to 5. So when I say, it's not that there aren't difficult pain control and other physical symptoms, shortness of breath control issues. It's not that there aren't those in even good palliative care. That's not what people are asking assisted death for. This is reinforcing, the Supreme Court is right. This is about requests that are suffering. They're suffering, not pain. Third, this is profiles of people in the Netherlands, which has, of course, extensive experience. This is a 2002 review of over a decade. The requests were based on fear of the future, uncertainty, fear, exhaustion and burnout from the illness, right? The fatigue of dying, the fatigue of chronic serious illness is sometimes the biggest suffering and frequently unrecognized. The desire to control an out-of-control process, think of Wit and Emma Thompson's character. Patients with significant depression, think of informed consent. You do know, I said this last night, in studies that we have, at least 30% of persons in most long-term care facilities have some features of a true clinical depression. Oh, what does that say? Right away you should hold on to this. You cannot make an informed choice if you're depressed. Can't be done. That's one of the features of depression. Patients with significant depression. And then this is a final group in the Netherlands, and it's here too. Patients with a firm belief that it's their right to choose the manner and time of death no matter what. But I'm going to say to you, in my experience, I know these people. I've been debated them, I know them, I've been policy work with them. But it's my experience that that's actually a small percentage of the population who think they support this. I don't know, I don't have any empirical data, maybe 10%. It's the other issues. So, if I could summarize for you the issues about suffering that I think are going to require a response from us to alleviate. Loss of dignity, loss of dignity, loss of dignity. And within loss of dignity is the loss of meaning, the total loss of meaning. Loss of dignity. Remember I said last night, one of the most difficult challenges is to accept these dependent intimacies. The kind of stuff that when grandma was dying at home, somebody did have to change her, somebody did have to clean up, somebody had to change diapers or put diapers on, people had to help her eat and had to help wash her, these intimate physical things. So the sense that because I feel undignified, I've lost dignity. Huge issue. We're going to look at, we can do stuff for dignity, and I'm going to show you Harvey Chachanov's work in a minute. Dependence, anathema in our society. To lose independence. It's like, this is a false understanding of who we are as humans. We are interdependent from birth to death, regardless of the myth of what happens in between, right? We have to be cut from our mothers with the scissors. I've done it, right? Out pops the baby, you got the baby, okay, give me the baby, I'm the pediatrician, give me the baby. But when you're delivering the baby, you have to cut the baby from the mother. Why do we not think that throughout the rest of our lives we are in fact embedded and interrelated in exactly the same way, spiritually and emotionally? The guilt of being a burden, huge, 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 huge issue for those who are dying, right? My God, the family's going to lose look what's happening to my mother, look at what happens to my son and his family. Huge. I want you to now begin to think of, if these are the reasons that I'm summarizing, what is going to be the response of the community? Uncertainty, future, and care needs, this is clearly the responsibility of a community. In fact, I would say to you, we have spent so much time and energy, because there's never enough money to give all the technological care towards cure and fix. It's just not possible with medical advance, whether it's advisable to do so or not. But we have done virtually nothing with long-term care. We have done virtually nothing with community care. And for the care of the elderly population, fastest growing population, total inversion of the population pyramid, their residential needs are as important as their physical needs. and their spiritual support. Zip, nada. Whether or not we have stuff covered in home and in community for long-term care, particularly care of the dependent elderly, it's a provincial hodgepodge. Okay? We have made no attempt to really see that the continuity of care has to go from acute care through to long-term care, rehabilitation, palliative care, and care for the dying. So of course we're going to be uncertain. And then loss of control and hopelessness. This is really interesting. Hopelessness, Pope Francis actually, again, my BFF, so I'm revealing, I love my Pope. Francis has this quote that just came out in the past month or two, so I haven't incorporated it. I do it for Catholic audiences, but you need to hear this. The Holy Father says, the issue of hopelessness should not be, or hope, should not be confused with optimism. So he's telling you, it's not hopelessness, it's hope. Optimism is an attitude. Some of you are optimistic, some of you are not. Some of you are glass half full people, some of you are glass, that's the way you lived your life. That's not what hope is. Hope is actually a trust in something bigger and larger. So don't get confused. And by the way, if you tell my father the truth about his prognosis, he'll lose hope. Again, a whole lecture of its own. Begs the question of what is it you're hoping for? What do you think? What is he hoping for? At our death, do we not hope for a legacy of a peaceful death for our loved ones? Do we not hope that we don't use up all the family money? What do you mean by this? So the whole issue of hope gets complicated. These are the reasons. So now very rapidly, because I want to say something about the communities. Coming to an end here. I want you to think then of those reasons that people request assisted death. They are, in fact, issues of suffering. And I want you to begin to think now about the requirement for an informed choice for assisted death and the notion of vulnerability and suffering, how vulnerability and suffering come together. So first, persons request physician-assisted death because they are suffering from conditions other than medical. Most suffering in human life occurs with no medical condition attached. Many people have serious medical conditions and die, and they're not suffering intolerably. So the important thing is the persons request physician-assisted death. The Supreme Court called it right. It's about suffering. But then we've got to think of, well, so why are we using medical death as a remedy? Second, voluntary informed consent, which is supposed to be the absolute requirement for assisted death, is compromised by disordered insight into your own self-worth, by self-stigma, depression, hopelessness, or other mental issues. Let me stick first on disordered insight and self-stigma. So all of the vulnerable who have chronic mental illness, who in fact see themselves as worthless because we treat them that way, all of the homeless who are on the street, all of the elderly that are in need of care, and see in the eyes of their caregivers disdain for the fact that they're repeating for the 20th time something that you already answered, or for their care needs. Okay? So self-stigma, the way that we in fact, this goes to the point that was raised last night, that an art of dying absolutely requires an art of living. The way we respond to these people, the way that we have responded to them throughout their life, makes a difference in how they approach death. All of these things compromise what we think is this intellectual process, and we have to pay attention to it. And then look at inducements, influence, and coercion from others. Had a mother I went to see for the palliative care team, big complicated issue, going back to the operating room for a third time. She was dying. She's 87, dying from her malignancy. And she was going back to the operating room again. And the nurses were, God love them, palliative care nurses are angels. And there are angels, but they don't have wings. She's going back for the third time. And when you talk to her, she said, "But Dr. Kenny, if I don't go, my son will be so disappointed with me. If I don't go, he'll think I gave up." These kinds of influences and coercion happen all of the time. So you want to talk about informed choice? Let's really talk about it in depth. Look at this last one, because now we're going to close out with a couple of challenges. Vulnerability is profoundly affected by our relationships and our interpersonal interactions. Particularly doctor-patient, there's a whole thing I give to physicians there. So I'll repeat again, different slide from last night. There's a difference between pain and suffering. Remember last night I used the example, you got chest pain? Hey, my colleagues in medicine got lots we can do. You've got suffering that I'm going to describe as heartache. I need to recognize it. But suffering is a disturbance in a sense of agency, who I am, loss of identity, sense of my life, etc. It's manifest in loneliness, rejection, guilt, despair, doubt, self-hatred. It's a total human, personal, social, and communal experience. So one, I got an injection or a prescription or a surgical procedure. For the other, this is where we do share burden. So how ought we respond? How ought we respond to these requests, which clearly the Supreme Court called it? They're about people wanting to have their life ended because of suffering. And now the question is, what are the issues that cause suffering? And in fact, can those who are suffering most really give informed consent? So let me just describe very fast. There are at least 4 places that we in the next decade, as we have to respond to this legalization, really need to be aware of. First, we really need this third wave of enhanced palliative care, and we need to support that hospice and palliative care as a philosophy should be protected, and hospice and palliative care units should be protected from physician-assisted death. It's not that physician-assisted death won't be performed by some docs who do palliative care, but the specialty really needs an enhancement, and it needs a retrieval of its commitment to the personal, spiritual, and familial. It needs to be enhanced. I mean, we still have most Canadians who do not get effective hospice and palliative care. Untenable! When in fact hospice and palliative care, when done well, is proven to alleviate some of their suffering. Second, we need to look very rapidly at the evidence that our responses to suffering directly affect the sense of dignity and the will to live. And third, I'm going to develop some challenges that I want you to discuss in small group or anything else you want to question, but I'll give you some starter questions to a compassionate community of faith or not. And I think the faith communities have got to step up to the plate here because there's so little sense of community elsewhere. And then the witness of Jesus. I'm going to end with that because I am who I am. Palliative care really has to be promoted and expanded. It's untenable that we're legalizing all of this without ever having affected the national palliative care program and standards that we asked for 15 years ago. Untenable. Untenable that people could be allowed to have assisted death without a mandatory consultation from really effective first-rate palliative care. Second, this is Harvey Chachinoff's work, and I absolutely, because of the time, refer you, go Google Harvey Chachinoff and Dignity Care. Fabulous website, fabulous kind of commitment. Harvey has developed what he calls the dignity conserving perspectives in response to care. Now just name them because of the time that we've got here. The things that matter to persons at end of life, and we've heard many of these in the film yesterday and last night. The sense that you can, empirically, this is shown by evidence, you can help restore a sense of dignity by allowing even dying persons to express and recognize their generativity, the story of their life, the meaning of a life lived. I'm not the dying 92-year-old crumpled up in the bed. I am this person who was a gorgeous 22-year-old dancer, who was a proud mother of teenage, right? It's the life lived. And see that the generativity is in fact continuing in ways that can. Storytelling, we talked about that yesterday. The issue of continuity of self. Again, recognition that we need to help persons who are dying understand that their life has been a process and that in fact the entire process has made them the person that they are. That they feel a sense of disintegration and loss of identity does not mean that they are less this total human lived experience. Role preservation. If you were the dad who was the decision maker for the family, that's the role you had. Or you're the dad, you makes everybody laugh. Dad makes everybody laugh, and dad's dying. Dad's not actually doing his role anymore. So it's not just the loss of the physical role, but it's also the helping people to appreciate and find ways with their loved ones to continue whatever their role was in the family. A maintenance of pride. Wow, you were really at Normandy? I can't believe you did. You got to be kidding. I didn't know that there was any Canadian alive who was at Normandy. This is amazing. This is an amazing story. Hopefulness, which again is different, and hopefulness is this understanding that you can rely on care, and concerns about the aftermath. So finally, the tenor of care. Harvey says the most important thing in the way in which we respond to those at our home, in our community, and in our healthcare institutions is the tenor of care. Our relationships matter. There's a thing called iatrogenic suffering. Now, iatros means doctor or treatment, and there's iatrogenic death, when a doctor or a nurse causes a death I don't mean intentionally, I mean by accident. A lot of our suffering is iatrogenic. So you saw in Wit, the doctor who comes in, and I remember the young guy, Emma's dying, and she says, well, what would you say to somebody who was anxious? Missed the clue completely, that she's anxious. This control freak, intellectual, John Donne scholar, super private, is anxious, and she can't ask it directly. And what does he do? He produces iatrogenic suffering because he misses the cue. So our relationships matter. Harvey's shown that beautifully, and directly affect will to live. Secondly, Harvey's shown that the question when we come to a person who's dying, whether considering assisted death or in any other aspect of care, is not, what's the matter with you? It's what matters to you. We shift the conversation entirely to this spiritual, familial, communal. Attentive listening to the sources of suffering, getting people to try to understand what is it about this thing you're experiencing, that you experience as suffering, where does it come from? Because it's not coming from the physical condition, and helping people to get at that. Again, the Archbishop Hayes kind of lesson to me, presence and non-abandonment. Absolutely crucial. And then therapeutic humility, recognizing there's a limit. Harvey's bottom line is that the preservation of dignity, which is directly related to the will to live, is in the eye of the beholder. When a person looks out, so this is me looking out at a patient, what do I see? Because the patient sees reflected in my eyes who I see and what I see. And that attentiveness to the person becomes crucially important. So, I believe we need to reclaim the particularly Christian duty. I think it's communal, but for me, the audience here makes it the Christian duty to the sick, dying, and bereaved. We even believe within Christianity that when we do it to the sick, we're doing it to Jesus himself. Whoa! Not just be nice to the sick. Doing it to the sick is in fact doing it to Jesus. And look at the story of the Good Samaritan. Really phenomenal, phenomenal. All these big hotshots, the big religious leader, the big teacher, judge, they both go by. It's the Samaritan, the person where you hardly expect. I had a janitor at IWK, a night janitor at IWK. He was, for some of the sickest and dying kids, the most important source of compassion and support. Because he'd do the little bathroom, and he'd talk about baseball and the Blue Jays, and he'd tell the little girls that their dresses and hanging up were cute. Sometimes care and compassion doesn't come from those of us who are big shots. All right? Where should we today then, knowing what we know about suffering, focus on witnessing to mercy and compassion to those in our midst? I'm suggesting particularly the chronically ill and handicapped, the mentally ill, the frail and dependent elderly, the dying, and the bereaved. the handicapped. It's not just the handicapped persons, it's those who care for them. The burden of care of families for handicapped persons is phenomenal. Do we go out of our way as a community to support? The care and support of the dependent elderly, particularly those who have been moved into facilities, is good if you've got a great family that's intact and lives in the same province. But what happens elsewhere? More than 60% of those who are over 75 live by themselves. And then what happens to who cares for them? So the spouse has died. Unless it's somebody from the church or the synagogue or the bowling league who keeps up with them, they can be totally lost forever. How about those with dementia? I'm telling you, this is going to be the next big step. The burden of caring at home for a person with dementia is phenomenal. Do we ever say, look, you want to go get your hair done? I'll sit with Charlie. I'll sit with you. Go. Our issues of doing that, they're sporadic, sometimes in our parishes, little committees. We're doing nothing as substantially as we ought. Care of the sick and dying, not just pastoral, spiritual care, but the care for all of us, and care of the bereaved. I can't end this without also saying, for those of you who are Christians, this issue of suffering gets even more demanding. Jesus in Gethsemane wanted to avoid suffering. I don't want to do this, Father. I don't want to do this. My favorite scene in all the scriptures. Always has been. Who do we know him as? Here's from Isaiah. We see in Jesus, Isaiah's a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. In the letter to the Hebrews, although he was son, he learned to obey through suffering. But having been made perfect, he became for all who obey the source of eternal salvation. Jesus' acceptance, remember I said last night, rather crassly, but I think it's the way to say it. If anyone in human history was going to get a do not stop at suffering, I'll take it now, I'll get you out now, it would have been Jesus Christ. For whatever reason, this was not the plan of God, and because Jesus surrendered to whatever the Father asked of him, what's imagined then for Christians in terms of resurrection is beyond human comprehension. So for those of us who are Christian, there's another set of obligations that flow here. And this is from Luke. It's written that the Messiah is to suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in his name to all the nations, beginning from Jerusalem. He suffered and died from the dead. You are witnesses. And again, I think for Christians, this is a reflection of its own. But I'm making a challenge to all faith communities and all communities that as we move forward, these are the questions I'd leave with the discussion. Can we create an art of dying? Remember last night? Ars moriendi. Can we create an art of dying? Or do we just capitulate to the technical fix? Plop, plop, fizz, fizz, relief is just a swallow away, the old Alka-Seltzer. Can we, in fact, create an art of dying? Can we accept our own vulnerability in an art of dying with implications for living and for the way in which we treat and respond to those who are living with suffering? Can we resist the medicalization of human suffering? Can we help continue to declare that this is a spiritual, familial, personal, relational, communal reality? And then can we accept the challenges to be communities of mercy and compassion today? Because I think that's what's called for.